verses 19 through 31. There was again division among the Jews because of these words. Many of them said, "He has a demon and is insane. Why listen to him?" Others said, "These are not the words of one who is oppressed by a demon. Can a demon open the eyes of the blind?" At that time, the feast of dedication took place at Jerusalem. It was winter. Jesus was walking in the temple in the colonnade of Solomon, and so the Jews gathered around him and said to him, "How long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Christ, tell us plainly." Jesus answered them, "I told you, and you do not believe. The works that I do in my Father's name bear witness about me, but you do not believe, because you are not among my sheep. My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. I give them eternal life, and they will never perish, and no one will snatch them out of my hand. My Father, who has given them to me, is greater than all, and no one is able to snatch them out of the Father's hand. I and the Father are one." The Jews picked up stones again to stone him. All right, so last week we set up this scene of Jesus in the temple from John chapter 10. And we described the atmosphere of Jerusalem, how the Jews, when it came to the topic of Jesus, were very much divided because of the words of Jesus. And many thought that Jesus was insane. Let me say it again. There were many who thought that Jesus was insane. They saw Jesus as a lunatic for what he was saying and what he was speaking, talking about how he was the light of the world, how he was the only good shepherd, how even he had the power to raise himself from the dead. Now, if you did not believe that Jesus was who he said he was, and Jesus says, "I have the power to raise the dead," and you did not believe that Jesus was the Messiah, what would you think? If I came up to you and said, "I have the power to raise the dead," what would you think about me? You're crazy. You're a lunatic. You must be possessed by a demon. So not only that, they could not explain away the miracle of the man that was born blind back in John chapter 9. They could not explain away the healing. It was a supernatural healing that was brought before a council of the Pharisees, and there was testified that it was a miracle, that this man was born blind and now he sees. So many concluded that Jesus was not only a lunatic, but that he was demon-possessed and that he got his power from the devil. Others didn't agree with that particular conclusion, because why would a demon heal the blind? And would a demon even have the power to do such a thing? So they were talking about Jesus when it came to his words. They were talking about Jesus when it came to his deeds. And there was a bunch of division amongst the Jews in chapter 10, verse 19. One translation says there's fresh division. All right, so the Jews have been divided over Jesus ever since Jesus came onto the scene. But now they are freshly divided when it came to the healing of the blind man in John chapter 9. So the events in chapter 10, verse 22, we talked about this last week, happened a few months after the events of the first part of this chapter. If you go back to John chapter 7, verse 2, that happened during the Feast of Tabernacles all the way up until John chapter 10, verse 21. And John chapter 10, verse 22, it switches over from the scene of the Feast of Tabernacles before to the Feast of Dedication 2 months later. And Jesus is still the topic of conversation and argument amongst the people of the Jews, even after 2 months. Everyone knew the wonderful man of Galilee. Everyone knew about the wonder worker named Jesus. Everyone knew that he was a miracle worker. And everyone was talking about Jesus when it came to him being in Jerusalem. So Jesus then very publicly goes to the temple on the stage of Solomon's porch. All right, everybody sees him. There's a crowd that encircles him, but this is not a spontaneous gathering. I really want you to understand this. This is not a spontaneous gathering. I would say it would be more like some of the protests that happen in our day and age, where people actually take like vacation time to go to a protest. They plan these things out, and these people were ready for Jesus to show his face in public somewhere. And when he showed up at the temple, the word there that is used is that they encircled him. All right? And we talked about this a little bit last week. I wanted to go into it more this week, but we had to get through the text. That term encircle is literally talking about what a pack of hyenas or a pack of wolves would do to a prey. All right? That word encircle is not a good word. And we discussed how last week this is a very hostile crowd towards Jesus. And if you didn't know that from what we read in the very last verse, in chapter 10, verse 31, how do you know it's a hostile crowd towards Jesus? What are they going to do at the end? They're going to pick up stones and try to stone him again, right? But before that, they asked Jesus to tell them plainly if he was the Christ, if he is the Messiah, that the Old Testament spoke of and that the people have been waiting for. And Jesus knows that this crowd is baiting him into saying something publicly about who he is. Because if he said he is the Messiah, what did the Pharisees already put in place as a law? Or they passed as like an edict when it came to anyone who confesses Jesus is Messiah, what? They cast out of the synagogue, they're cast out of the community, right? So they'd already set all this law up. What they wanted Jesus to say was he was the Messiah. Because if he said he was the Messiah in this very public fashion, they could arrest him and ultimately execute him. So if he said, yes, I'm the Messiah, they could publicly arrest him and accuse him of blasphemy grounds to get rid of him. So they're going to try to stone him again. And once again, I want you to see that word. They will try to stone him again. So what does that tell you about the crowd in John chapter 10, in the latter part of John chapter 10, as it relates to the crowd that was back in John chapter 8? If they want to stone him again, is it the same crowd? Yeah. So, in the last of John chapter 8, verse 59, where they try to stone Jesus and he passes through them, the same crowd that tried to stone Jesus shows up again at the temple. Is that a coincidence? That'd be a really hefty coincidence. So, Jesus narrows his answer to focus on the unbelief of the one who is asking the question. This crowd does not believe, as you'll find out in the conversation, this crowd does not believe that Jesus was sent from heaven. This crowd does not believe that Jesus was sent from the Father. They do not believe when Jesus says he was not of this world. They don't believe when Jesus said that Jesus and the Father are one, because what happens right after Jesus says, I and the Father are one, in verse 31. He ends his entire little conversation there with them. I and the Father are one. And what do the Jews do? They want to pick up stones to stone him. Did they believe that Jesus and the Father were one? Absolutely not. If you believe that Jesus was one with the Father and Jesus was God, are you going to pick up a stone and try to stone God? Absolutely not. So, this crowd does not believe. So, in the context and in the language of Jesus, he is explaining and focusing on the unbelief of this crowd. They do not believe. Now, you can see that in the text. There are 3 different times Jesus will say to this crowd in this text, you do not believe. You don't believe the words that I say. You don't believe the miracles that I perform, that I am from God. You do not believe. How do we know this? Look at the answer. They asked Jesus, tell us plainly whether you are the Christ. And Jesus told them, I told you, and you do not believe. Now, the intensity of this statement is kind of lost in translation because it's like us saying, you absolutely do not believe. You do not believe what I'm saying to you. You do not believe that my power is from God, and you do not believe that I'm from the Father. So Jesus goes further. Tells them the works and the wonders and the miracles that I performed in my Father's name, they bear witness. They are irrefutable evidence that you cannot deny. I am who I say I am because no one else can do what I am doing. You remember that 400-year period of silence before Jesus shows up? There was nothing when it came to that 400-year period of silence. When it comes to prophets, we don't know if there's any miracles that were worked during that time. When Jesus shows up, he starts doing all of these things. And Jesus says, all of the things that I am doing, they bear witness to the fact that I am from the Father. They did not believe. Jesus told them, Jesus showed them, but their minds and their hearts and their eyes were already following something else. They were already following another idea, and they had already come to another conclusion. It is what drove them to the temple in the first place to surround Jesus. Ask yourself the question, how in the world do you get a gathering of Jews as soon as Jesus shows up in Solomon's portico? How do you get a gathering of Jews together as soon as he shows his face in public at Solomon's porch at the temple? How do you get a gathering that wants to lynch him? Do you think it's spontaneous? Or do you think there's someone behind it? Who wanted Jesus dead from all the way back in John chapter 5? When he first showed up on the scene, who wanted Jesus dead? The Pharisees, the higher-ups. They were looking for a way to get rid of him. And Jesus shows up. We don't know if he stayed in Jerusalem, like I said before, or if he's somewhere else during these 2 or 3 months. He shows up in the temple, and there is a mob that encircles him at the temple, demanding that he state that he is the Messiah. Ask yourself the question, why would that happen? Now, in the immediate context, we ask the question, why in the world would these Jews, who had listened to Jesus and obviously seen what Jesus was capable of, want to stone Jesus again? And why in the world would they not believe and refuse to believe, even though he was working miracles that they could not refute or deny? Why and how did this crowd come to conclude that Jesus needed to be stoned for healing a blind man and speaking the truth about himself? Just lay it all out. How would any group of people come together with the same idea to kill Jesus because he healed a blind man born from birth and he said, I'm sent from the Father? There we go. Now we're going to tie this together with what Jesus says when it comes to the shepherd. There's only one shepherd, all right? Jesus says to them in chapter 10, verse 26, you are not a part of my flock. Now, remember this. You are not a part of my flock. If they are not a part of the flock of Jesus, you have to ask yourself the question, who is guiding them? Who are they following? If they're not a part of the flock of Jesus, they're part of another flock that's following another shepherd. Now, Jesus already said there's only one good shepherd, and that's me. And then he points to the Pharisees back in the first of this chapter, and he says, the good shepherd is not them. I am the only good shepherd. And you do not believe that. And Jesus says, because you don't believe that, you are not a part of my flock. Jesus is the one true shepherd and the only good shepherd. So if these people are not following Jesus as a shepherd, they are following someone else. Someone else who claims to be a shepherd over them. They are sheep being led and influenced by someone else. All of this is about Jesus being the only good shepherd, the only entrance, the only door, and the only way. And Jesus is exposing the unbelief of the crowd that is gathered around Solomon's portico. I want to get your mind on this. Do you remember what the reaction of the crowd was whenever the blind man started to tell them how he was healed? What was the response? You remember we went over this a few weeks ago? What was the response in John chapter 9? There wasn't celebration, there wasn't happiness, there wasn't praising God. What was the first response of the neighbors who found out that this guy was born blind and was now healed? Where did they take him? Where did they take him? They took him before the Pharisees. Anyone else find that odd? What did they just see with their own eyes? They knew this guy from outside the temple. They knew that this guy was blind. They knew that he was the one who was outside the temple begging for alms and he was blind. They knew that. But instead of believing their own eyes that this man was healed and believing what the blind man said, that Jesus was the one who did it in John chapter 9 verse 11, they take him to the Pharisees. Does anyone else see the connection? Jesus is performing miracles that no one else can perform. Yet when they see it with their own eyes, who do they go to? Who do they go to? The Pharisees. They are being led and shepherded not by Jesus and not by what the wonderful works that he has done and that he is doing. They are being guided and shepherded by their influence by the Pharisees. So they took him before the Pharisees, and they didn't listen to the explanation of the blind man. They didn't believe when it came to the blind man saying it was Jesus who did this, because they were focused on their shepherds, the main influence of their ideas, the main influence of their conclusions, the main influence of their beliefs was not Jesus. The main influence of their beliefs was the Pharisees. Even the blind man's parents, do you remember this? The blind man's parents did not even mention Jesus for fear of what? Being thrown out of the synagogue. Because that's what the Pharisees said. If there's anybody who would ever confess that Jesus was the Messiah, was the Christ, to be put out of the synagogue. The parents were even influenced and swayed by what the Pharisees were guiding the people of Israel to do, and that was reject Jesus. You cannot be a part of the flock of Jesus when you're listening to the voice of another shepherd. This was Jesus' point of this whole thing. He is the good shepherd. And you cannot follow the good shepherd if you reject the voice of the shepherd. If there is another voice that you are trying to hear besides the voice of the shepherd, some other voice that is leading you and influencing you besides Jesus, you cannot be a part of the flock. Because only those who listen to the voice of the Good Shepherd are in the flock of Jesus. You remember what happened after the blind man was healed and they cast out the blind man and Jesus goes and finds him in chapter 9 verse 40 and some of the Pharisees overhear what Jesus is saying about the Pharisees and about how they are blind and they come up to Jesus all pufferfish, like, I can't believe you're talking about us like that. And in chapter 9 verse 40 they ask, are we blind also? Jesus said, I have come to bring judgment. And we will see how intense that judgment is in just a second. So Jesus tells them the parable of the sheepfold in the first few verses of chapter 10. Now Jesus was the only door, and he was the only entrance to his flock of sheep. Everyone else outside of that sheepfold was a thief or a robber. Guess who he's talking about? Who was everybody else that was outside of that sheepfold? The unbelieving Jews and the Pharisees. They were the ones that were outside. But Jesus says they're thieves and they are robbers. Now, I want you to make the connection, but we're getting to this in a minute, hopefully. There's a very famous phrase that's used in John chapter 10, verse 28. It's a very comforting phrase a lot of times, but in the context, it's a very judgmental phrase. What's Jesus say in John chapter 10, verse 28? Those three statements. Somebody read them for me. Anybody? Anybody? All right, there's one. I'm looking for the last one.
Snatch them away.
Let me ask you a question. Does a thief or a robber snatch things away? Yeah. Do you know why Jesus was using that language? Because of the context of what he's talking about. He is the good shepherd. Everyone else is not. The Pharisees are not. The council is not. Everyone else is not. The only way that they get a flock, that they get sheep, is by snatching them away, stealing them away. If you're listening to the voice of Jesus above every other voice, you will not be snatched away. But obviously there were some who were listening to those voices. Because who was surrounding Jesus at the temple, at Solomon's porch of the temple? There was a crowd of Jews who did not believe that Jesus was who he said he was. What voice were they listening to? Jesus said, you're not of my flock, you're not listening to my voice. What voice were they listening to? The Pharisees, who said, he is not the Messiah. And when you listen to a voice that is not the good shepherd, you don't belong in that flock. The only ones who belong in the flock of God are the ones who listen to the voice of Jesus. So the Jews in Jerusalem are so influenced by those in power, they didn't even raise an eyebrow towards the direction of Jesus when this guy who was born blind was healed from his blindness. And they dragged this poor blind man before the Pharisees. And the Pharisees told the community, do not confess that Jesus is the Christ, because if you do, we will cast you out. That's what their shepherds were saying. And that's what their influence was saying. That's the voice they were listening to, not the voice of Jesus. So these Jews that make up this crowd, they're pressing and gathering around Solomon's porch like a pack of hyenas around a carcass. They were not following the voice of Jesus. They were following the voice of their false shepherds, of the Pharisees and the council, that told them to reject Jesus. And if you don't follow the voice of the only shepherd, you're going to be a part of another flock. After Jesus says that statement, you do not believe. I told you, you do not believe. I showed you and performed miracles, and you do not believe. You are not a part of my flock. You're not a part of my sheep. Let me ask you a question that comes in later. What's everybody in this analogy? You're not a part of my flock. You're not a part of my sheep. My sheep hear my voice. What is everybody in this analogy? They are all sheep. Now I like going to Matthew chapter 25 because that's where a lot of people go when it comes to this. In this analogy, everyone is sheep because they follow a voice. The ones who belong in the flock of Jesus are the ones who listen to the voice of Jesus. The ones who are part of another flock are listening to another voice altogether. The voice of the Pharisees saying, do not say that Jesus is the Messiah. Do not say Jesus is the Christ. So, if they are not a part of the flock of Jesus, they are a part of another flock. What flock are they a part of then? They are there to entrap Jesus, to ensnare Jesus, to get him to say something worthy of death by stoning. Does that sound familiar? Does it sound familiar to what the Pharisees want to happen? Like they are being influenced down to the T when it comes to the scheme that they're trying to use to get Jesus out of the way? That was the voice of guidance from their shepherds. The unbelieving Jews and Pharisees, these people were following the voice of another shepherd altogether, and they were not in the flock of God. Like we said last week, if you are following the one true shepherd, the one good shepherd, you're not going to try to stone him. When Jesus tells you the truth, you're not going to try to stone him. When Jesus shows you the truth by performing miracles that no one else can do and saying that they're from God, no one else could do those things. If you truly follow that voice, you're not going to stone him. But there was an idea that was put into the minds of these sheep, those that were following the Pharisees, that Jesus was not who he said he was. He's a false Messiah, and yeah, he does all these types of miracles, but he's not the one we're looking for. And all of those who were following the Pharisees followed their voices. And Jesus says, I'm judging this right now. You are not a part of my flock. You're a part of another flock. My sheep hear my voice. I give them eternal life. They will never perish out of my hands, and no one will snatch them away. You, on the other hand, you are following a shepherd that is not the good one. Now, I say this because context is so important, and I go over this and over this because context is so important. Jesus is speaking to a crowd of unbelieving Jews who are being led by the very people seeking to kill Jesus from all the way back in John chapter 5. Like I said before, it is a very intense statement that Jesus says. You absolutely do not believe. Even when I perform miracles, you absolutely do not believe. And you have to ask yourself the question, when you see a miracle performed that no one else could redo, no one else could, just make into some type of, CGI, it was a real miracle. And you see that performed right in front of your eyes. And the man who was born blind and has never seen a day in his life has seen everything for the first time. And he says, Jesus healed me. And the first thing that you do is drag him before a tribunal of the Pharisees. Where are you listening? What are you listening to? What are you being influenced by? When the first thing that you do, when a miracle happens that no one can deny, is you bring that miracle before the Sanhedrin, basically, and before the Pharisees and say, well, explain this. They're following the voice of another shepherd. They're listening to the voice of someone else, and they're following the works of someone else. Remember the blind man, freshly healed, dragged in front of this Pharisees. And now, Jesus, who is at Solomon's porch in the temple, has this spontaneous group, right, of Jews come up to him at Solomon's porch, asking him a baited question. How does that happen? They're following the voice of someone who's not the good shepherd.
Well, did the blind man believe in Jesus? So he did he not?
Yes, he did.
Even though they took him to before the Pharisees.
Oh, they cast him out. And that was when Jesus came to him and said, I am the Son of Man. I am the Son of God. I'm the Messiah. And Jesus was then worshipped by this man, and this man believed in who Jesus was. This blind man did not know who Jesus was until after the fact. He knew that he was blind, and now he sees. And Jesus was the one who did that. And that's what he reiterated to the Pharisees, was that Jesus was the one who did this. Or this man was the one who did this. I don't know how he did this. He just put mud on my eyes, now I see. But after they cast him out, Jesus went to him, told the man who he was. The man fell down and worshiped Jesus and believed. The exact opposite of what we see when it comes to the Pharisees and the shepherds of Israel. So Jesus says, you are not a part of my flock. You're a part of a different flock. Now, why is this so important? The reason why I spent all this time building this up is because, like I said last week, when we come to this set of verses, it looks like an off-ramp in Nashville, okay? You ever been on one of those off-ramps that go in like 50 different directions, and you have people like crossing lanes of traffic and cutting you off and all that stuff? You ever been there? This is how it happens when it comes to this verse. Everybody is going the same direction, right up until they get to John chapter 10, verse 27. And then they start going in all these different directions. And this commentary goes way over here and cuts all these people off over here. And these people are talking about once saved, always saved. And these people over here are talking about Reformed theology and Calvinism. And these people are blowing up arguments and words about how people are always unbelievers and God created them as unbelievers for destruction. There's all of these things that are going on in this text. And it seems to me everyone in the world that it has a commentary just kind of doesn't see the simplicity of what Jesus is saying. All these ideas and all these lanes and all these noise, and Jesus is stating the obvious about this unbelieving crowd listening to the voice of some other shepherd. And he says this, my sheep hear my voice, I know them, and they follow me. And that's it. My sheep hear my voice, they know me, they follow me. Now this crowd that Jesus is speaking to does not listen to the voice of Jesus. They hear the voice of the Pharisees wanting to kill him. They hear the voice of the Pharisees saying, he's a false Messiah. He needs to gotten rid of. So they hear the voice of their shepherds saying, this man is not who he says he is. And they refuse to come through the only door of the Pharisees, or they refuse to go to the only door of Jesus, and they try to follow the Pharisees. Jesus is going to use this language here in a minute when it comes to no one will snatch them out of my hand. The only ones who were following the Pharisees were the ones who did not believe in Jesus. You know the division that was caused? Ask yourself the question, who was it that would call Jesus a lunatic? Who was it that would fuel the fire when it came to Jesus being a crazy person and not knowing what he's talking about? Or who would fuel the fire into saying that Jesus was demon-possessed so they could cast him out? The way I look at this whole principle of I am the good shepherd, listen to my voice, my sheep hear my voice. And this other flock that Jesus is talking about, that they're not listening to Jesus, not listening to his voice. The way I see this is kind of like when I watch the sci-fi shows. I love sci-fi. And when they talk about time travel, some of you are like going to sleep right now. They talk about time travel, right? And where two objects cannot exist on the same plane. The parallel universe theory. I know you don't care about this, but this is how I see it. For those of you who want an older example, it's the Marty McFly effect. You remember Back to the Future, way back in the day? Right? The Marty McFly effect. Two of the same object cannot exist in two different spaces of time. Right? That's the whole theory of it. I don't believe it, but it's really fun to think about. Anyway, I see that like this text. If you're following the only good shepherd, and that's the only voice that you are listening to, and that's the only voice that you're following, what are all the other voices? They're gone. He's the only voice you're listening to. My sheep hear my voice. And that's it. If you don't follow the voice of Jesus, you can't exist in the flock. This crowd did not exist in the flock of Jesus. Jesus is blowing up their unbelief. And he is using very exclusive language here. Back in John chapter 9, in the last, he came to bring judgment, and he was bringing it hard. I told you, and you did not believe. I showed you, you did not believe. Now, I want you to notice this, and we'll talk about this more in the invitation as well. I want you to notice the change in description. It's very subtle. Jesus starts talking about my sheep in John chapter 10, verse 27. My sheep hear my voice. I know them. Did you catch the dig there? Did you get it? It's very subtle. Did you catch the dig? Anybody got it? It's hard to unsee once you've seen it. You do not believe. I told you, you do not believe. I perform miracles in the Father's name. You do not believe. You. I showed you. You notice the change? My sheep hear my voice, and I know them.
But the only one.
Not you, them. Huh?
The only one at this point in time that believes him is nobody but the blind man. I mean, if you read here, they're all following the Pharisees.
And this is the pattern. When you see the word Jews most of the time in the Gospel of John, it's talking about the unbelieving Jews that have gathered. That's another aspect of John. It's really fun to talk about. But these people were the unbelieving Jews. And we could see that when it comes to the text, because at the very end, what in their behavior tells you that they were not believers in Jesus? I mean, that's big. They wanted to what? They wanted to throw rocks, wanted to throw stones at him. They did not believe Jesus was who he said he was. He says, you do not believe. You are rejecting me. You listen to the Pharisees, and they tell you what to believe. You are not a part of my flock. My sheep hear my voice, and I know them. They will never perish. They will never be snatched out of the hand of the Father. Not you. Did you catch the dig? You are listening to the wrong shepherd. They are not. This is the mountaintop of the Good Shepherd analogy that Jesus has been describing. He is the only Good Shepherd. He is the only good one, not the Pharisees, not the leadership in Jerusalem, pressuring them to not confessing Jesus as Messiah. Jesus is the only Good Shepherd. All the other shepherds are false. Everyone in this text is a sheep. Even the unbelieving crowd at Solomon Sports, they're sheep. Everybody in this analogy, Jesus is saying, they're all sheep. Jesus even says, you do not believe because you are not my sheep. Everybody is sheep. The question is, and that Jesus hammers home, what shepherd are you listening to? What shepherd are you following? Whose voice is influencing you? And if they continued to follow the shepherds of the Pharisees, they would not have eternal life. Because only the Good Shepherd gives them that. They would perish. Because the only ones who don't perish are the ones who are following the Good Shepherd. They were going to be snatched away. But those who follow Jesus, they don't listen to those voices who want them to deny Jesus as the Messiah. And you see the rejection in their behavior after Jesus gets done. When he says, I and the Father are one. No one's going to snatch them out of my Father's hand. I and the Father are one. So Jesus puts himself on the plane of being God. I and the Father are one. Which also says, if anyone tries to snatch them out of my hand, the Father prevents that from happening. I and the Father are one. My power and the Father's power are the same. What is the reaction of the crowd? I told you, you do not believe. Though I showed you with miracles, wonders, you do not believe. I told you exactly who I am. I and the Father are one. They did not believe, and they showed that unbelief in wanting to kill him. I understand this is one of the greatest comforts of the entirety of the Bible. And we'll talk about this for a second. A lot of texts or sermons have come out of this text, and I understand that it is one of the greatest comforts. It's great. He gives us eternal life. We will never perish. No one will snatch us out of his hand. And I get why there's so much debate, but the context of these verses is anything but comforting. This is exclusive language that Jesus is telling this crowd. Now, if it was a good sermon, and you think it's a good sermon, what do you do when it comes to something being a good sermon? You say amen, you shake the guy's hand. What did they want to do at the end of the sermon? They wanted to stone him. So we say, it was a great sermon, right? This is a great thing to say. At the end of the sermon, nobody wants to kill the preacher. If you read John chapter 10, verse 26 and 27 and 28, you're not going to get stoned after that. These words are very intense to the audience that they are spoken to the point that after he says them, they want to kill him. The people did not shake his hand. Jesus just exposed their unbelief and the consequences of following the wrong shepherd. There are great blessings in following Jesus. And that's what a lot of people key in on when it comes to this text. What a lot of people don't key in on is that this text was very divisive to the crowd it was spoken to, because they did not believe that Jesus was who he said he was. Sorry, I went a little bit over. Questions, comments before we end?
Well, so there was nobody in this crowd except for the blind man that was following, was the sheep.
We don't know that the blind man was there.
Well, we don't know, but he did say he believed Jesus was
Yes, and the disciples were somewhere. They kind of get lost in a few chapters. We don't know exactly where they're at. You know, there's a lot of things that happen with Jesus that we're not told the disciples were there or not. But we know that John was there because he was an eyewitness and all these things. But at the same time, the events of the previous chapter happened 2 or 3 months before. So we don't know if the blind man was at the temple or not. What we do know is that when Jesus started to walk around Solomon's porch, this group of Jews, who obviously had hostile intentions, gathered around him and encircled him. What was that? He was cast out. So, yeah, if he would have been in the temple, that would have been bad news for him anyway. So, that's a good point. So, he probably wasn't. So, if he was cast out of the synagogue, that means he couldn't have gone to the temple. So, I don't think he would have been at the temple. That's a good point.
Who was that?
The blind man. He was cast out of the synagogue. So he wouldn't have been amongst the Jews at that time. He was cast out. Unless, well, we won't get into that. There was 3 different casting out, but we won't get into that. That's good. Good comment. All right.